A future where our own Parliament and our own government, accountable to the people of Scotland, are responsible for the decisions and the international partnerships that shape our direction and our destiny.
Should old acquaintance be forgot for old lang syne.
عام 2014 وبقيادة رئيسه والوزير الأول لاسكتلندا آنذاك أليكس سالموند خاض الSNP الحزب الوطني الاسكتلندي استفتاء شعبيا من أجل الاستقلال عن بريطانيا، وكان ذلك وفق اتفاقية وقعتها كل من الحكومة الاسكتلندية والحكومة المركزية في لندن. إلا أن النتيجة جاءت بعكس التوقعات، فنسبة 55% صوتت للبقاء ضمن المملكة المتحدة في مقابل 45% مؤيدة للانفصال. لكن الملف لم يغلق بعد، فمن يريد الانفصال ولماذا؟ ومن يسعى للمحافظة على الوحدة العتيقة وكيف؟ تساؤلات طرحناها على اسم درس بعمق الملف من كل جوانبه، وهو البروفيسورة نيكولا ميك إيوين المختصة بالسياسات الإقليمية في جامعة إدنبرا، وكذلك على فرح فرزانة ونيكيتا باسي من مجموعة SNP بيم التي تمثل الأقليات الإثنية السوداء والآسيوية في الحزب الوطني الاسكتلندي. نيكيتا الهندية الأصل وفرح الباكستانية الأصل والمولودتان في اسكتلندا تستعيدان التاريخ وتسعيان بإصرار لتكراره بالانفصال عن المملكة المتحدة. وأما ختاماً فقد حملت لي الزيارة لقاءً جديداً مع زميلتي منذ أيام الدراسة الجامعية دانيال رولي، التي كانت منذ ذلك الحين ترفع شعار أفضل معاً Better Together، وهو الشعار الذي مثل المعارضة الاسكتلندية للاستقلال عام 2014 والمتمثل في حزبها حزب العمال الاسكتلندي وحزبي المحافظين والليبراليين الديمقراطيين. دانيال التي انخرطت في السياسة وحجزت مقعداً تحت قبة برلمان المملكة المتحدة في ويستمينستر، أسألها اليوم هل ما زال شعار أفضل معاً صالحاً؟
I went to a lot of debates, I read a lot of information, and I just wasn't convinced that the cause for independence was really strong enough. And I wasn't convinced that breaking away from this union was really needed. I thought we could have, a change of government. I campaigned for the Labour Party to get elected in the next election that happened, and I really thought that we could make all of the changes that people want. But within the UK, I didn't think we needed independence to make those changes.
The majority of valid votes cast yesterday by the people of Scotland in response to the referendum question, should Scotland be an independent country, were in favour of no.
There was a lot of discussion that was happening, such as currency. Where would Scotland be in terms of currency? And then later on we found out that the Bank of England actually did say that Scotland has the right to use a sterling pound. So there was a lot of lies that were told during 2014 to ensure that people voted the way that the status quo wanted them to vote.
The independence movement might be seen in terms of the broader movement for self-government that led to the Scottish Parliament being established not so long ago, just over 2 decades ago. And that created an opportunity for the pro-independence party, the Scottish National Party, to, over time, become the government. So as a government, they could advance their central ambition of making Scotland independent. And we saw in 2014 there was an independence referendum then. It led to a no vote, but it was close enough to make sure that the issue wouldn't go away. And here we are again.
It's not a huge amount of time that's passed, but a lot can happen in politics. So we've had 3 general elections for the UK Parliament. Each time a Conservative government has been elected, We've also had the Brexit referendum, and Brexit has happened since then, so a huge amount has changed. And I remember in 2014, people were saying, well, you know, this was a once in a generation, once in a lifetime vote. We can't just have another independence referendum in 10 years. And I agreed with that then, but now I think, you know, gosh, so much has changed. You can't say things are the exact same in Scotland as they were in 2014.
What I will never do is allow Scottish democracy to be a prisoner of Boris Johnson or any Prime Minister.
So I think first of all it's important to note that Scotland is divided on the issue of independence. So it wouldn't be accurate to talk about there being a Scottish will for independence. About half of the people in Scotland would like it and about half of the people would not. Why do they want it? That's really interesting too, because in 2014, when we last had this vote, it was really difficult to point to a reason because people were broadly happy with the way that Scotland was governed in the UK. They were broadly happy with devolution. Now, it's a very different scenario, and the main trigger, I would say, is Brexit.
البريكزيت كلمة السر التي أعادت فتح ملف استقلال اسكتلندا بعدما كان قد طوي عام 2014. فالأرقام تشير إلى أن نسبة 62% من الاسكتلنديين صوتوا ضد الخروج من الاتحاد الأوروبي، لكن بنسبة 52% خرجت المملكة المتحدة كاملة من الاتحاد. لكن اليوم وفي شوارع اسكتلندا حديث عن أمل بالعودة إلى حضن أوروبا، وذلك بعضوية اسكتلندية فردية هذه المرة بعد تحقيق الاستقلال.
A lot of people voted no in the Scottish referendum, thinking, well, that's the best way to be part of the EU. And then Brexit happens.
It's just not democratic. Why should we have to suffer detrimental effects on a decision that we never made? Now we have also a pro-independence coalition with the Green Party, and they have both promised us that we will now get another independence referendum and they will fulfil that mandate. It is our democratic right.
There are three issues about Brexit. One is the fact that the UK is no longer in the European Union. The second is the fact that a clear majority of people in Scotland did not want that. And so there's a feeling that their preference, their voice as a nation was not recognised, could not be recognised and accommodated within the United Kingdom. So it's as if Scotland and the rest of the UK seem to be going on divergent paths. The third thing is that the Scottish government was, along with the Welsh government, was largely marginalised from the Brexit process. They were ignored in a sense. We saw the Liz Truss say that Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, should be ignored. So there's something about the regard with which the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament is held in by the current UK administration and its predecessor that has made people a little bit less comfortable living within the United Kingdom as it stands.
I really believe we are a family and we're better together. And I think the best thing to do with Nicola Sturgeon is ignore her. I think look, I'm sorry.
It's a bit difficult when she's First Minister, though. She's got a democratically elected position, just as you would.
I'm sorry, she's an attention seeker, Seb. That's what she is. And what we need to do is show the people of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales what we are delivering for them.
It's not saying that the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon speak for Scotland. That's not what this is about. But Scotland have voted for Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP in 8 consecutive elections. So for Liz Truss to say that just goes to show what Westminster think of Scotland. They don't care about us at all.
لطالما كانت علاقة لندن بإدنبرا علاقة ندية خالصة، تغلب فيها لندن إدنبرا مرات عديدة منذ اتحاد الاثنتين خلال القرون الثلاثة الماضية. لكن لندن أيضاً تتنازل عن كبريائها أحياناً إدراكاً منها لأهمية إدنبرا المحلية والإقليمية. إدنبرا التي حققت جزءاً من استقلالها عبر برلمان أبصر النور عام 1997 عندما أقر نظام التفويض.
England is very, very centralised, and because of that, I think the UK government has never really adjusted to devolution. It doesn't think in the way that a federal government thinks. So its mindset is still quite centralised, and that can be a real cause of frustration for not just the SNP government in Scotland, but also the Labour government in Wales and the parties that occasionally govern in Northern Ireland. And that's one of the issues, I think, why we see tensions arise from time to time.
I think that devolution is a fantastic thing for Scotland, and we have a lot of powers here, such as housing, education, transport, but those that are still reserved to Westminster, like our foreign policy, immigration, they're so important. And I do think that there's a real difference of opinion in Scotland to England. In Scotland, you know, we have huge marches in support of refugees. We have welcoming parties when people arrived here from Ukraine. You know, we have a huge solidarity for Palestine movement in Scotland, which I think feels really different to parts of England.
We believe in human rights. The UK is a member of the United Nations. However, the person that represents the UK on the United Nations is not doing a good job at all. If Scotland were to become independent, we would be a member of the United Nations in our own right. So when we've got atrocities and genocide and apartheid going on around the world, then that gives us a stronger voice as an independent country to speak up against such atrocities and holding other governments to account.
But again, I think we could separate from England and be our own independent country and make our own foreign policy, and that would be great. But the UK would still have the policies it has, and actually by taking Scotland's voice away, it then weakens our place. We don't have that voice then in the UK, and so will the UK become more hostile? Will it become more right-wing? And that, I think, is a real risk, and it's not something that people in Scotland have to take responsibility for, of course, but for me it's a real worry that then our neighbour will be very right-wing and very hostile on a world stage.
بين الأحزاب اليمينية واليسارية تتفاقم الأزمة السياسية بين حكومة اسكتلندا والحكومة المركزية في لندن.
This is the beginning of the end of their precious union. And their distorted Etonian vision for society. Scotland will not be ignored anymore.
والحزب الوطني الاسكتلندي الذي يقوم على أساس القومية ما زال يستقطب الكثيرين في البلاد.
Nationalism has a lot of negative connotations, but we want to make sure that it's pursued as civic nationalism. Civic nationalism means that it's not about where you come from, what colour of skin you are, whether you're Scottish, English or British or any other race. It's about where we're all going together. When you're part of Scotland, when you're in Scotland, you are a Scottish citizen. So that's one of the main messages of our party.
الحزب الوطني الاسكتلندي المعروف بالSNP يعد أكبر أحزاب اسكتلندا تعداداً وتمثيلاً في البرلمان الاسكتلندي، وثالث أكبر أحزاب المملكة في ويستمنستر بعد حزبي المحافظين والعمال. تأسس للنضال من أجل الاستقلال عن المملكة المتحدة، ووصل إلى السلطة للمرة الأولى عام 2007، أي بعد دورتين من تأسيس البرلمان الاسكتلندي. ومنذ ذلك الوقت وحتى يومنا هذا لا يزال الحزب يحتل التمثيل الأقوى في البلاد.
Well, in Scotland we've seen a really interesting shift in the past 10-20 years where the Conservatives at first lost a lot of votes, and then they've been coming back. In the Scottish Parliament, they're the second biggest party. So it's interesting when there's a real feel in Scotland that we don't vote Conservative here, but actually they are quite a big party compared to what they used to be. But I think their messaging in Scotland is very different. We had a leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Ruth Davidson, and she resigned because she didn't get on with Boris Johnson when he became Prime Minister. So they're the same party, but they're not, I would say, as right-wing as the UK Conservatives are.
The fact that politics in Scotland is now so dominated by the independence issue has helped the Scottish Conservatives actually have something of a comeback, because they are the party that is most clearly aligned with opposition to independence and the defence of the Union. And there are many people in Scotland who feel that have that particular perspective and oppose independence very deeply. So the Conservatives represent that group, but the Conservative government...
Not the Labour anymore. It used to be the Labour as well.
So the Labour Party, yes. The Labour Party also opposes independence, but they're not as clearly identified with it as the Conservatives are. And that's why it's been very difficult for the Labour Party.
So I think in our party we should be able to have that discussion and look at the facts, try and flesh out what the economic situation might be if we were independent. And so I hope that Labour in Scotland will become more open to that discussion, but it's difficult because then we have a lot of voters who are firmly opposed to independence and they want us to stand up for them and speak out for them.
When politics is dominated by independence versus union, the Labour Party somehow gets squeezed in the middle, and they would like very much for people to stop talking about the Constitution and talk about the cost of living crisis or poverty and inequality. That's what they want to focus on, but these issues are all bound up with the constitutional issue in Scotland.
الأزمة المعيشية أزمة تتلقفها حكومة إدنبرا وتصوب من خلالها على فشل حكومة المحافظين في إدارة البلاد.
SNP MPs down in Westminster have asked multiple times for the Westminster government to put their hands out their pockets and actually do something about what's going on. Vulnerable families can't afford to eat. Vulnerable families can't afford to heat. They've been given the option of heating or eating. That's not humane at all.
I think the cost of living crisis is a real worry for people across the UK. It's difficult because in Scotland you think, well, we don't vote Conservative on a whole, but we have a Conservative government who are certainly making the cost of living crisis worse. So if we were independent, then would we be economically in a much better place?
Yes, I mean, Scotland's not a poor country. It's somewhere in the average within the UK. There's no reason why it couldn't survive economically and indeed prosper as an independent country. But there's no question that the transition would be difficult, because when you have the UK outside of the European Union, outside of the European single market, and you have Scotland with the ambition of rejoining the European Union, then that turns the border between Scotland and England into potentially an EU border, and that is way more difficult. It affects freedom of movement potentially, freedom of labour movement, labour mobility, and all of these things. And those are issues, tricky issues that weren't there in 2014 that the Scottish Government still has not quite presented practical, workable solutions for.
على عكس تقديم الحلول لكل الملفات، تكثر حجج القوميين نحو الدفع إلى الاستقلال. النفط مثال على ذلك. فقد أضاف اكتشاف نفط بحر الشمال قبالة سواحل اسكتلندا نحو 193 مليار جنيه استرليني إلى الاقتصاد البريطاني بين عامي 1975 و2020.
Historically, the fact that there has been a lot of oil in the North Sea has been a key component of the pro-independence movement. All of the revenues from oil are collected by the United Kingdom government, by the UK Treasury. There's nothing directly that comes to Scotland from there, although indirectly one could argue that there are transfers and so on. But nowadays, oil is a much more difficult issue for the SNP and for the pro-independence side for two reasons. One, it's very volatile. The price is very volatile, and so relying on oil revenues is very difficult in making the economic case for independence, because sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. The other reason, though, is that the SNP, along with the Green Party, which is also pro-independence, are seen to want to be very committed to addressing climate change, and that's very difficult to marry a commitment to climate change mitigation with a continued commitment to exploring North Sea oil.
ربما يسهل على المرء مناقشة أي قضية سياسية من بعيد، لكن تبعاتها على الأفراد والمجموعات ليست بالسهولة نفسها.
I think the independence debate in Scotland, particularly in 2014, was very divisive. People felt so strongly about it, and it was good to see people really caring about politics, but it did break families apart. There's still people who maybe don't speak to each other. I think I felt quite strongly that part of my family are English, and I would go every single week down to England and visit them. And I had a real fear that, we don't know if there would be a border there. So a lot of people had genuine concerns, and I think that was often shouted down. And so it wasn't a very healthy debate at times.
We don't want a hard border. We will never advocate for a hard border or for any other kind of policies that would cause families to split. Yes, families have political differences, they have different of opinion, and that's our human right to have difference of opinion. But in terms of what you're mentioning about would families be separate, there's nothing that the SNP is proposing that would suggest that that situation would come to light.
Independence is not about division. It's not about separatism. It's just about choosing our own future, a better future. And I think a lot of the younger generation are now very acutely aware of that. This is not, the Westminster government is not what we want.
انفصال، اتحاد، استقلال أو لا، ملف شائك لسؤال يتجدد كل حين وحين، ملف لا يطوى بفعل الزمن، وسؤال عن مستقبل مبهم، فهل يمكن التكهن به؟
No.
Not at all.
Can anybody predict the future?
I'd love to see into the future, but I don't think we can.
I'm really scared for what things will be like when my son grows up.
It's not going to be easy, the transition to independence, but it will be a much better future for her kids, my kids, and my kids' kids. It's going to be a much more prosperous country, and it's for the best.
I think the UK will be very different. I would ideally love the UK to be one country but with a lot of devolved states, so not just Scotland to have further devolution, but actually parts of England have more devolution too. But I'd like him to be able to travel and meet family that we have in England without having to stop at a border.
Whatever happens, if there is a referendum, if there is a yes vote, it doesn't change geography. It doesn't change the fact that Scotland shares an island with the rest of Britain, and so they will still have to find some ways to work together on issues like COVID, pandemics, climate change. All of these things will big issues that transcend constitutional allocations of power.